So I want you to imagine a country where the economy just completely collapses by like nearly 70% in a single decade.
Which is just a massive number.
Right, like the central government is scrambling, banks are failing, life expectancy is plummeting, and the whole social safety net basically vanishes overnight.
Just gone.
Yeah, exactly. And if you were looking at a country going through that level of trauma, you probably expect it to fall to the absolute bottom of, well, every global ranking imaginable.
Oh, absolutely. You'd expect total chaos.
But the data we're looking at today for this deep dive shows something that honestly seems impossible.
Yeah, it's a complete statistical anomaly, honestly. It really forces us to entirely rethink how we measure human progress.
Right.
Because today we're looking at a huge stack of sources, specifically this 15-page professional academic slide deck, and its raw data set spanning from 1990 all the way to 2023.
Which is a huge time frame.
It is, and it's tracking all these global and national metrics. And the subject of all this data, the country that went through that exact economic freefall and came out the other side with this totally bizarre, fascinating profile, is the Republic of Moldova.
Which brings us to, I guess, the core mystery we want to unpack today for you, the listener. Because there's this deeply ingrained assumption in, well, global politics, right?
Yeah.
That economic growth inevitably leads to social fairness. Like the idea is that you have to get richer as a nation before you can get fair.
Right. The whole trickle-down fairness idea.
Exactly. But Moldova completely breaks that rule. The very first slide in our source material calls it a mismatch miracle in Eastern Europe.
I love that phrase.
It's so good because you look at their Standard Human Development Index for 2023, that's the HDI, the basic measure of how well a country is doing, they rank 86th in the world.
Which is, solidly middle of the pack.
Yeah, they're a lower middle income nation. But, and this is the crazy part, if you shift over and look at their Gender Development Index, the GDI, their global ranking isn't 86th.
No, it's not even close.
It's 6th, literally number 6 in the entire world for gender parity.
It's just staggering. I mean, the first slide visualizes this perfectly for the listener. It's this minimalist design, right? You've got this plain gray circle on the left representing their HDI, and then on the right, this bright, vivid blue circle for their top-tier GDI ranking.
And just a massive red question mark connecting them.
Exactly. Because how does a middle-income country, one that, doesn't have the deep financial pockets of a Norway or a Switzerland, how do they manage to achieve world-beating numbers when it comes to balancing the scales between men and women?
That is exactly what we are going to try to decode today. Okay, let's unpack this. Because the underlying mission here, the philosophy of this whole slide deck, is that development shouldn't just be measured by how much money a country is hoarding. It's about how fairly that development is distributed across the people and how much pressure the country is putting on the planet to get there.
Because a huge GDP doesn't mean much if only a tiny fraction of the population actually benefits from it, or if you completely destroy your own environment in the process.
Yeah, totally. So to understand this gender miracle, I feel like we need to establish the baseline first.
We do. We have to look at the Standard Human Development Index, the HDI.
Right. So for those of you listening who are used to just hearing about GDP on the news all the time, the HDI was created to give a much more, I guess, human-centric view.
Yeah, it doesn't just look at cash.
Right. It averages out 3 main pillars: health, education, and the economy. And the slide says it's graded on a scale from 0 to a perfect 1.0.
And if we look at slide 2 and pull the 2023 global baseline, the world average sits at roughly 0.756.
Okay, so globally we're at a C+.
Yeah, a fair assessment, I'd say.
Yeah.
Now, Moldova sits slightly higher than that global average. They're at 0.785.
So solid B.
Exactly. And the trend line is interesting, too. Back in 2005, they were at 0.702, so they've been steadily climbing.
Even with recent global events.
Yeah, I mean, the data shows a dip around 2020 and 2021, which makes sense given the state of the world then. But they've shown incredible resilience. They consistently stay above that world average line.
But what's fascinating to me isn't just that final number. It's the internal composition.
The ingredients of the score.
Yeah, exactly. Because when we break apart those 3 pillars, health, education, and economy, the picture of how people actually live there gets super complicated.
Yeah, it really does. Let's start with the health dimension. The researchers measure this primarily through life expectancy at birth, and this is actually where Moldova struggles pretty significantly.
Yeah, slide 3 gets into the, what do they call it, the canvas of life. And the numbers here are pretty sobering.
They are.
The 2023 world average for life expectancy is 73.4 years. But in Moldova, it's only 71.2 years.
So they're trailing the global average by about 2.2 years.
Right. And, 2 years doesn't sound like a massive gap when you just say it casually, but on a population level, that translates to millions of lost milestones.
Oh, absolutely. Grandparents missing graduations, much shorter retirements. And the historical data reveals this terrifying vulnerability underneath that average.
What do you mean?
Well, look at the systemic fragility. In 2020, life expectancy for Moldovan women was a respectable 74.2 years. But in 2021, the data shows this massive plunge. It crashed all the way down to 69.0 years.
Wait, really? A drop of over 5 years in a single calendar year?
Yeah. And the men experienced parallel massive drops, too.
I mean, I know 2021 was basically the height of the global pandemic, but
Yeah.
dropping 5 years on a national average, that's catastrophic. Why do they get hit so much harder than other nations with a similar GI?
It really comes down to this concept of systemic redundancy. Or, well, the lack of it. Like, when a wealthy Western nation faces a global shock, they have deep financial reserves. They can just outbid other nations for medical supplies or rapidly build emergency infrastructure. They can subsidize their people to stay home.
Right, they can throw money at the problem.
Exactly. But Moldova, lacking those deep economic reserves, was profoundly vulnerable to supply chain issues and external shocks. Their healthcare system was already stretched thin, and under that kind of pressure, it just buckled.
Wow. Okay, so, and this is my big question here. If their healthcare system is buckling and they're behind the global average in health, how is their overall HDI higher than the world average?
That's the paradox.
Right. Like, is it like a student who's completely failing gym class but somehow getting an A+ in everything else?
That's actually a perfect analogy, because they are getting an A+ in the classroom itself. Education is the life raft here. It's the engine driving their entire HDI score.
Okay, slide 4, the knowledge engine. This was the data point that actually made me do a double take.
It's a huge outlier.
It really is. Globally, the mean years of schooling, like the average amount of time a person spends in formal education, is 8.7 years.
Right. Which is, middle school level, basically.
Yeah. But in Moldova, that average is an incredible 11.83 years.
It's a massive lead. They're almost 35% ahead of the global average when it comes to keeping kids in school.
That's insane.
And when you look at the mathematical formula for the HDI, this educational advantage is the core driver pulling their whole national score upward.
But how do they afford it? Because that brings us to the third pillar, the economy. And their income numbers, according to slide 5, are not great.
No, the economic shortfall is very real.
If we look at gross national income, or GNI, per capita, and this is adjusted for purchasing power, the world average is roughly $20,327.
Okay.
But Moldova sits at just $15,866.
So they trail the global average by almost $4,500 per person.
Right. And I know they've grown massively since the late 1990s when they were down at around $5,000.
Oh, yeah, the recovery has been significant.
But they're still way behind. So you have a country with lower income, a struggling healthcare system with lower life expectancy, but they have this absolute superpower of an education system.
Exactly.
So to summarize, lower income, lower health, massive education. How does that specific recipe translate to being number 6 in the world for gender development?
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting, because to understand that, we have to transition away from the general population stats. We have to apply a strict, unforgiving gender breakdown to these metrics.
Okay, so separating the data by sex.
Yes, this is where the dimensional strike happens, as the report calls it. We discovered that Moldova doesn't just have gender parity in some of these metrics. Women are actually statistically outpacing men.
Okay, so let's look at slide 6, the GDI miracle, the Gender Development Index. Conceptually, the GDI is basically just a ratio, right? You take the female HDI and divide it by the male HDI.
Exactly. So a score of exactly 1.0 would mean perfect, absolute equality. Men and women achieving the exact same levels of health, education, and wealth.
Okay. And the data point for Moldova's GDI in 2023 is 1.029.
Which is just a phenomenal achievement on the global stage.
Wait, I want to push back on this for a second.
Sure.
Because if the score is over 1.0, doesn't that mean the system isn't actually equal? Like, doesn't 1.029 mean female human development in Moldova is scoring higher than male development?
That's an excellent critical point. And yes, mathematically, a score over 1.0 does mean female human development is scoring higher.
So why are we celebrating a system that's skewed in the other direction?
Because we have to look at why it's happening. And if you look at the education data, the picture becomes clear. Females in Moldova have a higher expected years of schooling, It's 14.98 years for women compared to 14.31 years for men.
Okay, so women are staying in the education system longer, getting more advanced degrees.
Yes. They actually average 11.9 mean years of schooling compared to 11.7 for men. But the other side of that 1.029 ratio is the male struggle.
Oh, interesting.
Like a lot of post-Soviet nations, Moldova has a significant disparity in male life expectancy, higher rates of occupational hazards, cardiovascular issues, things like that. So the 1.029 isn't just women are winning, it's a reflection of incredible female educational triumph happening alongside real vulnerabilities in the male demographic.
Ah, I see. It's not a simple victory lap. It's a complex reality.
Exactly.
But if we already have this GDI telling us how the genders compare, why do we need the next index in the source material? The Gender Inequality Index, or GII. Aren't they basically measuring the exact same thing?
They sound similar, but they measure fundamentally different things. Think of the GDI as a measure of achievements, schooling, income, but the GII, the Gender Inequality Index, measures loss.
Loss, like wasted potential.
Precisely. It measures the loss of human achievement due to structural inequalities, systemic barriers. It looks at reproductive health, empowerment, and the labor market. So for the GII, a lower score is better.
Because you want less loss.
Right. Lower means you're losing less of your society's potential to sexism.
Got it. And the numbers here are wild. Slide 7 shows the global average for the GII is 0.455. So the world loses almost half of its female potential to structural inequality.
It's tragic, honestly.
It is. But Moldova's score is an incredibly low 0.146. They rank 43rd in the world on this metric, which is amazing for a middle-income country.
It really is. And the main reason they score so well here is what the data shows under reproductive health.
Slide 8, the health triumph. When I read this part, I literally couldn't believe my eyes.
It's the most striking data in the whole report, I think.
The global average for maternal mortality is 216 deaths per 100,000 live births. That's the baseline danger women face globally. But in Moldova, that rate is 12.3.
Just 12.3 compared to 216.
It's insane. The slide points out that their maternal mortality is barely 5.7% of the world average, and adolescent birth rates followed this same trend.
Right. The global average is 39.1 births per 1,000 young women, but Moldova's down at 23.0.
But here's what I don't get. We just spent all this time establishing that their healthcare system is fragile.
Right. The 2021 drop.
Yeah, that they took massive hits to life expectancy because they don't have deep financial reserves. So how on earth do you achieve a maternal mortality rate of 12.3, like massive state-of-the-art billion-dollar hospitals everywhere? What is the actual mechanism there?
It's a brilliant paradox. You don't need a multi-million-dollar MRI machine to prevent maternal mortality. What you need is systemic reach and a cultural prioritization of safe motherhood.
Okay, so what does that look like in practice?
It's a legacy of the old Soviet healthcare model. Highly centralized, universally accessible preventative care. It wasn't about luxury. It was about covering the basics for absolutely everyone.
Right.
So even when their economy crashed, they maintained this network of local clinics, trained midwives, and skilled birth attendants. They made sure almost every woman had access to basic prenatal monitoring and essential hygiene.
So it's about raising the floor, not the ceiling.
Beautifully put. Yes.
They might not have the fanciest hospitals, but they make damn sure a pregnant woman in a rural village has a trained professional checking her vitals.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because maternal mortality is a highly sensitive proxy for how much a society values women. And by keeping the adolescent birth rate low, they prevent young women from having to abandon their education.
Which directly fuels the next dimension, empowerment. Slides 9 and 10. Because when young women aren't forced out of school by early pregnancies, they stay in the classroom.
They do.
The data says that 97.9% of Moldovan women have at least some secondary education.
Which is basically universal. Compare that to the global average, which is just 62%.
And what does a society do with an entire generation of highly educated women? They put them in charge.
Yes, they do.
The political power numbers are amazing. Moldova boasts 38.6% female representation in parliament. They're absolutely crushing the global average, which is sitting at a really dismal 26.5%.
And it's fascinating here is how this creates a positive feedback loop. When women make up nearly 40% of the legislature, they influence the national budget. They vote to protect the funding for maternal health clinics.
Oh, wow, right.
They protect the funding for schools. The education creates the politicians, and the politicians protect the education.
It's totally self-sustaining. But okay, the real anomaly, to me, The thing that makes Moldova so utterly unique, even compared to, like, wealthy Western nations, is what happens in the labor market.
The labor market anomaly, slide 10. This is where it all comes together.
Yeah. Globally, there's this massive participation chasm, right? Female participation in the formal labor force is only 47.5% globally.
While men are up at 74.1%.
That is a gap of over 25%. Think about what that means in reality. That is billions of hours of female labor and economic power just sitting outside the official system.
Usually trapped in unpaid care work.
Exactly. But in Moldova, female labor force participation is 70.1% and male is 71.7%.
A gap of just 1.6%.
Less than 2%. That is statistical parity. Men and women working side by side at almost the exact same rate. But again, I have to ask, how? If the global gap is over 25%, how does a struggling country close it to 1.6?
Well, it's a mix of economic necessity and systemic support. In a lower middle income economy, dual income households aren't a luxury, they're a requirement for survival.
Right. You have to work.
But necessity alone doesn't close a 25% gap. If women don't have childcare, they can't work, no matter how badly they need to. The mechanism here is their historical infrastructure of early childcare and kindergartens. Plus, because they're so highly educated, they aren't just entering informal low-tier labor, they're qualified for administration, technical sectors, education.
So, synthesizing this whole dimensional strike,
Yeah.
you have near universal secondary education for girls. You have a healthcare system that fiercely protects reproductive health. And you have the infrastructure allowing women to enter the labor market at the exact same rate as men.
And all of that compounding together elevates the entire society, completely overriding the limitations of their GDP. It proves you don't need Western-level wealth to treat women fairly.
It's like a cheat code for human development.
It really is.
Which actually brings up a really compelling thought. If they're so uniquely good at balancing gender, does that equality apply to social classes too? Like the gap between the rich and the poor?
This is where we need to zoom out. We're moving into section 3 of the report, slides 11 through 13, looking at the true value of development. We need to adjust for inequality and then adjust for their footprint on the earth.
Let's start with the economic distribution. Slide 11 introduces the inequality-adjusted HDI, or the IHDI.
I like to think of this as the shrinkage factor.
Yeah, or like a leaky bucket. Like the standard HDI is how much water is pouring into a bucket. But the IHDI measures how many holes are in it. It penalizes a country's score based on the inequality of how those resources are shared.
Right, because if one person has the whole pie, the society as a whole loses out.
Exactly. Like if a tech billionaire moves to your small town, the average wealth skyrockets, but you don't feel any richer. That's a statistical lie, and the IHDI penalizes that lie.
And globally, the data on this shrinkage is pretty grim. Human development globally suffers a 22.9% loss due to inequality.
Over a fifth of all human progress just lost.
Yeah, but look at Moldova. Their inequality loss is only 8.4%.
Wow.
So even though they have a smaller pie to begin with, it's shared so evenly that their true rank jumps up massively. On the IHDI, they rank 59th in the world.
That's incredible. They hold on to the development they create, and this philosophy of efficiency naturally leads to the final and maybe most important index, the PHDI.
The Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI, slide 12.
I find this one fascinating because it penalizes countries for carbon emissions and material footprints. It basically asks, are you destroying the planet to get your high standard of living?
Because development at the cost of the biosphere is just deferred destruction.
Right. So looking at the data, global per capita carbon dioxide emissions sit at 4.54 tons, but Moldova is at 1.74 tons.
Less than half the global average.
But, okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second. Is Moldova at 1.74 tons because they built some utopian green energy grid? Or is it just because their heavy industry collapsed in the 90s and they literally can't afford to burn as much carbon?
That is a totally fair critique. And historically, yes, it's the latter. The Soviet collapse led to massive deindustrialization. They shifted to agriculture and services. So it was green by necessity, initially.
But the index doesn't judge intent, right? It just judges the math.
Exactly. And because they achieve high human development without destroying the environment, their PHDI ranking skyrockets.
On slide 13, it says they jumped to 40th in the world.
40th in the world. That is a massive 32 places higher than their standard HDI rank. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the slide plots this on a coordinate axis. Moldova is sitting right in the ideal quadrant. high eco-efficiency, low planetary pressure.
They're proving you can have a highly educated, fair society without the massive ecological destruction we usually assume is required.
But to really understand how they got here, we have to look back at the 30-year arc. Slide 14.
Right. Because you don't build this by accident.
Uh,
The historical data from 1990 to 2023 is wild.
it is. Think about the collapse we talked about at the start. In 1990, their GNI was around $16,000. By 1999, it had crashed to $4,500.
Just a total free fall. And we saw male life expectancy drop to 62 years.
But despite that trauma, they didn't just focus on corporate wealth to rebuild. The data shows they maintained their educational infrastructure.
Yeah, that female mean years of schooling line, it never dips. It just climbs steadily through the 90s, the 2000s, right to today. They never stopped educating their girls.
Which formed the absolute bedrock for the miracle we see today. It takes 30 years of unbroken investment in mines to get a GDI of 1.029.
Totally generational. So what does this all mean? We've thrown so much data at you, the listener. What are the global lessons here? Slide 15 breaks it down into 3 takeaways.
Right. First, education and gender equality are the best weapons against the middle-income trap.
Second, low inequality lets middle-income countries have an incredibly high quality of life.
And third, ecological efficiency is the future core of national competitiveness. And I really want you to think about this in the context of your own country. Are we too obsessed with the GNI line while ignoring that 22% loss to inequality or the environmental pressure we generate?
It's such a vital question. And I want to leave you with a final thought, inspired by the end of the slide deck. Every metric tells a story, and equality is the foundation of hope.
It makes you wonder, if we completely redesigned our global rankings to prioritize human parity and planetary survival over raw GDP, who would the real first world countries be?
It would completely redraw the map of global power. We really need a better way to measure what actually matters.
We do. And maybe Moldova just gave us the blueprint. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We'll catch you next time.